This is Hannibal here from thehannibaltv.com, and we have the legendary Stampede wrestling star Dan Kroffat back with us for a part 2 interview today. Not only has he wrestled for Stampede, but he's wrestled all over the U.S. He's even had WWE matches here and there. So how are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing good. I'd like to thank you for having me back again. Obviously, it was a pleasure being on your show, and I certainly had a lot of feedback from friends and acquaintances who viewed the show, and they appreciated the candor and the opportunity you gave me to speak about those subjects.
I had a lot of positive feedback from it as well. I was surprised some of the people that watched it, just because I hadn't heard from them from a while, and they contacted me and said they were happy to see that you were doing well. So it's great to see that you've been a success after wrestling.
Yeah, the word success has different meanings to different people. And I think that maybe our subject today, quite often we equate success to where you are in the world financially. And success to me has been a combination of things. And I think one of the big features in success might be relationships. And I think talking about that today is important. And along with it, in that conversation, sometimes, we experience failures too. And I don't think that's a subject that we should avoid. I think we should talk about the failures in our lives and in our careers. And your program gives me an opportunity to talk in those terms. So today I'll share some of my points of view on success, but also on some of the failures and regrets and the dark side to the business as well.
Well, a lot of people wanted me to get into the subject of the hostage situation that you were involved with after wrestling, when you went to work in a jail as a prison guard, I guess, in British Columbia. So maybe you could start off by telling us how you went from wrestling to being a prison guard. What made you want to get out of wrestling?
Well, that's a really good question. I think it was associated to my family more than anything. I felt that was 1980 when I decided. I was 35 years old at the time, and I had 2 very young girls and my wife, and I just felt like I owed it to them to have more of a stable family life. And I thought that Vancouver Island, where I grew up in the Victoria area, was a great place to take them. And my biggest concern was career after wrestling. At that time, I thought I'll take a break from wrestling and see if I can find another career. And when I got to Victoria, fortunately, I was hired on by the Department of Corrections there at a place called VIRCC, Vancouver Island Regional Correctional Center. And I took all the courses. They sent me to the Justice Institute, and I studied all the courses and passed them all. And then I was asked to do a self-defense program, which I brought to the center and worked with a lot of the staff in that. And then I worked my way up in the ranks, and I found myself finding somewhat of a career. But also it was during a difficult time. 1980, interest rates were around 18%, and it was hard. It was a difficult time to make ends meet. And I had not made a lot of money in wrestling. I think I had mentioned that to you before in a previous interview. And yeah, there was a degree of glory associated to it, and it certainly opened doors. I have no regrets, but I guess if I had thoughts about going back in life, as we all do, I would have probably pursued more education and probably went into the world of marketing or something, because I found that was something I really enjoyed. But in arriving in Victoria, I had 2 young girls. They were around 5 and 8 years old, and I needed to provide for them. And driven a little bit of my motivation was fear of the fact that I couldn't provide for my family. So wrestling was not paying the kind of money that had a long-term sort of goals that I could set, that I thought that one day we'd be, very, very comfortably. So I felt like it was a time to move on. So in taking this job in Victoria, and working in a prison is an interesting world. I can tell you that, I have the highest regard for the people that work in corrections. They're under a lot of stress constantly. and it's a very demanding job. But at that time, in 1980, as I say, there was a recession going on, interest rates were high, and it was an opportunity that I thought I needed to take to provide for my family. So as time went on, there was a situation occurred where three fellows who had been convicted of first-degree murder had been shipped to this prison. It was a remand center. It was not an actual federal prison where people go to spend longer periods of time. This was a sort of a launching pad, if you will. They would bring them into this facility, and then they would determine where these individuals would be sent to serve out their time. These three individuals had been convicted of murder, and they had been given 25 years each. So they were brought to this prison, and after a period of time, word had come down that they had had a gun smuggled into the prison. So the director of the facilities came to me, and with the training that I had had, he asked me if I would put together a team and do a search of the wing in which these prisoners were held. And so I put together a team, three other fellows and myself, and we went in and wanted to conduct a search. So what we did is we locked them all down in their cells, and then we brought them out one at a time for showers. And while they were showering, we then sent two people in to search their cell to see if we could find the gun. The three individuals we had in mind were the ones that we kept till the end. There were approximately 30 inmates at that time in that particular wing. And we left these three to the very end. They were in individual cells. And one in particular was the one that I had the most concern about because he seemed to be the leader. And so we left him to the very end. And of course, as things sometimes work out, my instincts were right. We brought him out last. It took us about 2 hours. This was in the evening in October of 1984, and it took us about 2 hours to shower and search all their cells. And then this last person we brought out, he came out of his cell, walked down the tier, and then headed down the stairs. Then at the last minute, he bolted and ran down to the end of the day room where there were a huge pile of clothes where all the inmates had left all their dirty clothes. And he reached into the pile of clothes. And to this day, I have no idea how the gun ever got there, but he pulled the gun out, and then he came running back towards myself and another individual who were sort of overseeing the searching. And he fired a bullet shot above our heads, and then he told us not to move, and that he was taking us hostage. The two fellas that were up on the top tier were able to escape. They ran down the tier and out the gate and left myself and this other person behind. So this guy was pretty clever, actually, because he realized he was in a fairly precarious situation. What he did then is he asked us to strip down, and because he was stripped naked, he stripped us naked too, and stood us against the wall. And the reason for that was that I think that he was anticipating that maybe snipers would be brought in, which eventually they were, incidentally, outside the building, positioned on other buildings, trying to get a shot inside the window to take him out. Of course, here we are standing naked, and I'm to this day not sure really what happened on the outside, except within about an hour's time of being taken hostage, he was negotiating or trying to negotiate with the director of the facility, but the director indicated to him that he was unable to meet any of his demands and that they would be flying someone via Vancouver helicopter to the facility in Victoria, who was a negotiator that had the authority to make any deals. The deal he asked for was that he and his two cohorts would be released from prison. Well, we all knew that would not happen. I knew, listening to the dialogue and the conversation, that this was going nowhere. And the other rule too was that they never released a prisoner based on negotiations like that to the freedom. So I knew that eventually would go nowhere. But he continued to negotiate. Then finally, they brought a SWAT team in, I found out later, and they were positioned outside the building trying to get a clear shot through the windows, but they were unable to because he kept himself pretty well out of sight. So we continued to stand there for approximately an hour, as I say, as the negotiations went on. They were going nowhere. And then he finally indicated that if they were not going to be set free, he was going to shoot one of us to make his point. I knew that it would probably be me because I was in charge of the search detail, and I just had this instinct it was going to be. And so I heard him ask the last time to them, he said, unless you're going to, set us free and meet our demands, I'm going to shoot one of these guys. And there was a moment of silence up there, and they said, we're sorry, we can't do that. We're willing to do any other thing to facilitate your needs, like better housing or whatever the negotiations were that would be a little better for him. But he didn't buy into that. So he said, no, he said, this is going nowhere. I'm shooting one of these guys. So he lifted his gun and he was pointing it at me. And of course he shot me, and the bullet went through me. I went back against the wall. I went down onto the ground, and immediately I just laid there. And for some reason, it's sometimes hard to explain, but being shot wasn't near as painful as you might expect it to be. The only thing that concerned me a lot is I was laying on the concrete floor, and the blood was really pouring out quite profusely. And so what I did is eventually, he thought he killed me actually when he shot me. And he said, I heard him say, okay, that's one down, one to go. And then the voices upstairs, the negotiators said to him, please don't shoot the other person. We need to continue the dialogue. Let's find a compromise. Let's talk. So the conversation went on, and I laid there perfectly still. I could feel the warm blood forming around my body. And I thought, in order for me, if I had any chance of survival, I had to maybe let on that I was dead. So as time went on, I started to realize I was losing a lot of blood. So I took my thumb and I put my thumb in the bullet hole to stop the bleeding, and which it did do. And then, of course, the things that go through your mind when you're laying there, I remember just like it was yesterday, vividly, that there were things that I wish could have happened. I was 39 years old at the time. I was going to be turning 40 in June. I'd never see my 40th birthday. I thought about my two girls. They were home in bed. This was in the evening, late at night. They were sleeping. That was a good thing. I remember forming two hearts in my own blood with my fingers when he wasn't looking. And I put the initials of my daughter's and my wife's initials in the hearts, because I sort of anticipated this was going to be the end of things. So I laid there for a couple of hours, actually, and the only thing that was starting to happen was I was starting to get really cold, and I felt like hypothermia was setting in. My body started twitching. He then realized that I was still alive, and he made reference to that. He talked in terms that if they didn't meet his terms, he was going to come over and finish me off. And I remember laying there, wondering, God, where's this going? And then an interesting piece in this is sort of like movie stuff, is that I heard the negotiators upstairs say to him, if you would allow us to get him out since he's still alive, we'd talk about maybe improving things for you when you're transferred to a federal institute. We could get a good facility for you. You could have visitors, things, they were trying to offer. So for some reason, he said, you know what, come and get him out of here then. I think he was using me as a pawn in the negotiations. And I thought, all of a sudden I thought to myself, oh my God, I'm going to survive this. I've stopped the bleeding, and I'm going to get out of here. This is pretty amazing stuff. And then, about 15 minutes went by or so, and nobody's coming down. And then I hear a voice up top say to him that don't pay any attention to the four people coming in to get him with a stretcher. They're just, they're people that are coming in, but don't be distracted by their appearance. And he seemed to be a pretty bright guy. He said to me, oh, I know exactly what you're doing. You're actually sending in a SWAT team as a disguise. He said, you know what, forget about it. You can't have him. He can stay here. So as you can imagine, my hopes were dashed immediately. I went from this high of thinking, my God, I'm going to get out of here, see my kids and wife again, and then to the back, I'm here. I'm not going to get out of here. So it was a bit of an up and down emotional moment for me, of course. And then they said, no, there's no issue at all. And then all of a sudden, they also said, gee, we can't get anybody to come in there because they don't trust you. They think you're going to take them hostage and shoot them as well. And that made sense to me. I could understand how maybe any paramedics or anybody would think that maybe he would just increase the hostage situation by taking more hostages. So it seemed like I was doomed. And ironically, it took about 6 hours, if I remember well, that I was there. And like I said, the hypothermia piece of it became fairly apparent. I was really getting cold. I was shaking. I lost a lot of blood. And then, funny enough, almost like a wrestling angle, I thought maybe I could get myself out of here. So then I said to him, he was aware of the fact I was still alive. And I said to him, if I can get myself out of here, that way you don't have to deal with SWAT or paramedics or anybody. I said, would you agree to that? And they could hear me upstairs because he was about 15 feet away from me. So he said, you know what, if you can get yourself out of here, you can go. Okay, now my hopes are up again. I'm thinking, oh my God, I can't believe this. I may be able to talk myself out of here, which is proven to be beneficial to me to be able to negotiate my own way out. So I said, okay. So I said, I started to crawl towards this big steel gate. And of course, I had to get keys to open the door. So I put my arm through the big gate outside and along the ground, and somebody slid the keys. They must have been a good bowler or something, because the keys perfectly hit my hand. And I was able to pull myself up somewhat. I opened the gate and I swung out on the gate. And of course, my co-worker was still in there. He held him hostage to continue the negotiation. But I was fortunate. I got out of there. There was an ambulance waiting, and the media was there, of course. And it was the middle of the night. And I was taken to the hospital. And then, of course, they mended my arm. They operated on me, and it went right through the back of my arm and out, and they repaired my arm. And to this day, I still have a little bit of an issue with my arm over it. The radius bone and what have you was, pretty well fractured. But all in all, it was an experience that movies are made out of. And of course, several things happened after that, actually some positive things. And but that was sort of the whole story. And as well, the other fellow, my coworker, was released about 45 minutes later. They negotiated something, and these three individuals were finally shipped to a federal institute where they spent their 25 years. This happened in 1984. So they spent their 25 years, and I would assume today all three of them are released and living somewhere in Canada.
That is an incredible story. What were the positive things that came out of it that you mentioned?
Well, the strangest thing is that they invited me, the Department of Corrections invited me to come back. They said to me, once you healed, you're more than welcome to come back. And they elevated my position. I was a senior member of the staff there. So I was, even the incident even gave me the opportunity, if I wanted to move up to a higher ranking. And I probably would have spent my whole life, in the department as maybe in a managerial role of some part or something, because the opportunity was there for me. But of course, my wife pointed out that it was a very traumatic time and difficult for her. And we discussed it, and she was not comfortable with me going back. And I understand her point of view. I think she was absolutely right. And from my kids' point of view too, they were very young at the time, and I just felt like I had a responsibility, which I've always felt, to them. And so I decided not to go back. But the one thing I did do to go back, I felt like I owed it to myself and to fellow staff members. About a month after I was on the mend, and I was moving in a better direction, I went back to the facility and I walked around that wing. I walked into that wing. I walked around to show the rest of the people that were there, the inmates, that I was okay, and that it wasn't a matter of, it wasn't a victory for the guy that shot me. It was more of a point of saying that, we come back from these situations and we move forward. So I wanted to demonstrate that to not only inmates, but also to the people that I were working with, that I felt I owed it to them. And then, the other thing is that finally I made a decision to come back to Calgary. I should tell you that maybe one of my great motivations in life to succeed was fear. I remember, if I could just share a short story with you, is that when my first child was born, or our first child was born in 1976, I remember watching my wife in 30 hours of labor. I must say, thank God we as men don't have to have children. I don't know if I could take the pain, but when we received our child, the first thing I felt was, oh my God, I have an obligation to provide for this child. And I wasn't skilled at all. I really didn't have any skills that were, things like, I have two brothers who are very skilled, and I just wasn't skilled. So I was concerned. So I remember going to a movie and sitting there through a movie in a dark theater thinking, oh my God, I've got a child now, I've got a responsibility. So I really thought I need to really work hard at succeeding to provide the best I can offer for my kids and for my wife. And I sort of kept that to myself most of my life, that I was afraid, my motivation was that I was fearful of the fact that I couldn't provide for them. So we came back to Calgary, of course, and as I say, I started a business. And the good news, as I say, is the fact that I'd had a career in wrestling, and I made a decision. It was time. I'd come to a crossroads that I needed to move forward and be more productive. But my business flourished like it was amazing. It took off immediately for me when I came back to Calgary, because my wrestling career gave me somewhat of a personality, and people knew who I was, and I had the great luxury of having a business that was successful. So it really provided me the opportunity and the means to provide for my kids. So, I may have lived in Victoria forever and may not have been able to provide for my girls as well as I was able to provide for them because of the incident, coming back to Calgary, opening the business. And then I found myself back in wrestling, which was interesting again, because I came back to it totally differently. I was given opportunities to really finish out a career, which as I did. And it was more fun when I came back the latter time after, with my business and everything else. So I was able to retire at 60, which was, almost 16 years ago. And I saw both my girls grow up to be very successful. And of course, we all have regrets in life. And, I have some regrets that, unfortunately, I call them the Humpty Dumpties. You can't go back and fix them, but you try not to repeat your mistakes in life. And if you learn from them, and, I hope I have. But that career in Victoria, I went there with the hopes of, probably ended up spending my whole life there. But of course, circumstances quite often change that.
There's a fan on here that says there was a wrestler named Nathan Jones who was in WWE that said wrestling was tougher than being a prison guard. I guess he was a prison guard over in Australia. Obviously, you had a horrible experience, but if it wasn't for that experience with the hostage situation, how would you compare being a prison guard to being a wrestler?
Well, it's dramatically different. I guess I would somewhat disagree with him, but then I don't know his circumstances, so it wouldn't be fair for me to comment on his position. But I will speak to what I think correctional people go through, and I think the public at large are not aware of it. When you're on the front line of working in a totally stressful situation every day, I think that what I learned and saw was that correctional people are under a lot of stress. They're dealing with the criminal element, and they're also constantly under threat. I mean, I saw numerous occasions where, inmates who were in for very severe charges would threaten prison, employees. Many of the officers that I worked with had, they had a lot of disorders. Like there were a lot of people suffered mental issues after working 15, 20 years in that world. So it was terribly stressful. Where the world of wrestling for me was a whole different world. It was a business world for me. I think I pointed out in the other interview that I recognized early in wrestling that for me to succeed or to create any kind of a legacy or to stay longevity, I had to see it in a business form. So I immediately moved in the area of ideas and, like we talked about, the ladder match and other things like that provided me the ability to actually sort of have fun in the business too. The world of travel, meeting new people. I mean, the accolades that went with it, the fans support. There were a lot of things that were very positive that I would suggest that the world of working in a correctional institute, working in a prison, I don't think they're comparable, to be honest with you, but maybe he had a different experience. But I would say there's far more stress associated to the individuals, dedicated people who work in the world of corrections.
There's a fan on here wondering if you became any more religious out of that experience.
That's a really good question. It's funny. That's an excellent question. I don't think I became more religious, but I think what's happened is you go through a transition. You start to look at your values in life, and you start to, it's funny. That's a really good question. I think that one of the biggest changes in life is the realization of what's important, your priorities. In that situation for me, I remember laying there for almost 7 hours thinking about little things that were, things that maybe I didn't appreciate, thinking about my kids and what I will never do again. So when you move past those situations, there's a lot of potential possibilities. You could get PTSD as an example, post-trauma stress disorder. Or for me, I actually moved away from it more in a positive vein and more appreciative. And I think the older I've got, I put more value now in relationships than I do accolades or achievements that really are not as important as we think they are. So religion, no, I don't think I found religion, but that was a good question.
John is wondering if there's any of the old Stampede wrestlers from your era that you still keep in touch with.
Oh boy, not really. Unfortunately, sadly, the response to that is most of the guys that I had worked with and really had a lot of pleasure in working with are gone now. But Bret Hart and I have been staying in touch pretty regularly. Periodically, we still talk. I know he's done well in the business, and he's a great example of someone who not only, managed his money well, but he managed his life well too. But I don't know. I really lost touch with most of the guys, and as I say, a lot of fellas have passed now, and we're of that age that we're certainly losing a lot of our people that we worked with.
Well, the early deaths of a lot of these wrestlers too is one of the dark sides of the ring, so to speak. You mentioned to me before we started you wanted to touch on some of the not so glorious aspects of professional wrestling you've witnessed in your career. Maybe you could go into some of that now.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is regrets. I think if you would have talked to a lot of wrestlers, maybe one of the biggest regrets that wrestlers and all of us would have that we might share is the relationships, the loss of relationships, neglecting our families, neglecting our kids. One of the things, I call it the Humpty Dumpties in life, the things that you can't go back and fix, is that if you've neglected your kids, you've missed maybe one of the greatest opportunities ever given to you. It's the greatest gift ever given to you, is to watch your children grow up and be a part of their lives. And if you haven't played that role, if you haven't been a part of that role, you selfishly, egotistically, narcissistically, whatever your reasons are, that you go in your own direction and you take your children and family for granted. I think that's one of the dark sides. And I would suggest that maybe some other, maybe wrestlers might or may not want to talk about it. But I remember reading Bret Hart's book, and I thought he was very transparent. He talked about other relationships outside his marriage, how he had lost a lot of time with his kids. And that certainly stuck with me, because I think I'm also guilty of the fact that maybe I didn't give my kids as much as I should have. I measured the value in the wrong way. Being raised, by a father who told me that the three elements of life was a roof over your head, clothing on your back, and food in your belly, and be grateful. But there's a fourth element too that I think is extremely important, if not the most important, is earning the love of your children. And if you don't do that, then those three other factors are not, I don't think, are significant. So one of the dark sides is I think that the regrets that many of us have, that we've missed the opportunity of playing more of an effective role and a responsible role with our children.
What did you think of Diana Hart's book? Did you ever get a chance to read through that one?
That was interesting. Funny you bring that book up, because I remember going to the bookstore to buy it, and it was removed from the shelf in so quickly. I never did get to read it, but it was certainly a controversial book. She had spoken quite candidly about everything, my understanding is, but I never read it. But, I think I'd heard all kinds of stories about the book, but as I say, it was pulled off the shelf. So I don't know, there are so many, you brought a point up earlier, so many wrestlers who had died so young. I think another dark side of the industry is the expectation and the demand that's put on young wrestlers coming into the business to get bigger and get better, and quite often turning to steroids and things like that. I think there needs to be more education and more information available to really the damage. I saw so many guys who I watched over the years just change physically. It was remarkable. And I was always afraid to touch it, because I just felt like I'd once seen Lyle Alzado's interview. He was a football player from the U.S. NFL, and he died of steroid overuse, and he had a chance to interview and talk about the effects of it. And that was another really dark side. We weren't being paid a lot of money, and that's another sort of myth associated to wrestling, is that you become famous and rich. Well, the fact of the matter is very, very few guys became rich. And even some of the guys who became rich, another dark side is the mismanagement of their financial affairs. So many guys made a lot of money in a short period of time, 3, 4, 5 years. But when their careers were over due to injuries or they were cut, a lot of them ended up with nothing. And unfortunately, their stories are not told because you never see or hear them again, but they live under very difficult times. So, the industry is not as glorious as people think it may be, unfortunately. I'm glad to have been able to be a part of something that brought entertainment, but I think, all industries, whether it's the music industry or the film industry, the entertainment industry, there's always going to be dark sides associated to it. And recognizing and talking about these stories, my hopes are that young listeners, people who are pursuing careers in wrestling or in anything at all, they're cognizant and they're aware of the fact that you have to be very, very careful in your decisions, not only your financial management, but also the health issues and the emotional cost of being involved in the entertainment industry. If you have a family, think about where do they sit in your priorities. So there's a lot of issues associated to the entertainment industries that people need to be aware of.
One of the issues that people are more aware of today is the concussion issues in sports as well as professional wrestling. Do you think you had concussions during your career? And if so, did you just continue wrestling or did you ever take a night off?
No, ironically, I was very fortunate. I've seen guys in the industry take a chair over the head. A lot of it, there are a lot of injuries. Like some of the things that happened in the business, you could very easily end up leaving the business with concussion. I have a football friend, well-known Canadian football friend, who retired because of concussion. And it's become more of a front and center conversation now, concussion, for years and years, unfortunately, in the world of pro football in the US. And I'm not sure about Canada, but I remember the conversation that a lot of the management, owners of teams and that, this goes back quite a ways, they wouldn't acknowledge concussion, and a lot of painkillers were used on athletes, whether they threw their knees out or shoulder separations, but concussion was sort of neglected. And it was only in recent years that really they addressed the subject. And, I remember one of the greats of all time, I think his name was Mike Webster in the NFL. He had committed suicide, and they attributed that to all the concussion over the years. So I think there might have been a few wrestlers who, retired with issues regarding concussion, but it's a subject that should be addressed as well, because it certainly has terrible implications, especially as a person grows older.
What were your thoughts on that tragic accident that Owen Hart had? Because I know you must have known him since he was a small child.
Yeah, I knew Owen. I first remember Owen coming into the dressing room with his dad. He was about 4 years old, and over the years, I got to know him quite well. He was everything that he was said to be. He was funny. He was a jokester. He was very personable. Such a very likable guy. Really very complimentary. I remember many times I'd come out of the ring after a match, and he'd come over and say, "Hey, great match." And even if it wasn't a great match, he was complimentary. He was just a terrific guy. Brett had flown me in to meet the WCW group and talk about some promotional ideas. He had set that up for me, and I went to Kemper Arena where Owen had fallen. And Bobby Heenan and I did a little commentary on the show that night, and we talked about it. And I saw the facility where he fell, and pretty dramatic. And boy, that when I looked up at the ceiling, looked down, I could only imagine what would have gone through his mind. The only thing that I've always felt about that I know that his dear wife has always had a voice in opposition to Vince and to the world of pro wrestling. And I'm not one to comment on her position because of the fact she's certainly has her rights to feel as she did. But I will add one piece to it that I always wondered about, was that the show should have been stopped, in my opinion. But the show carried on. And to me, that was a big mistake. When you've lost a life in the world of entertainment right there on the stage, as you will, I always disagreed with that. And of course, I don't know the fundamentals of what went wrong. I don't have firsthand information because you hear both sides of the situation. I heard many different opinions on it, so I can't speak to it with any validity. But I would just say that the one piece that I was really disappointed in was that the show went on. I thought that was a mistake.
Would you have been able to wrestle on a show after witnessing one of your coworkers pass away like that?
I'm sorry, I missed that question.
If that had happened on an event you were on, would you have had a hard time wrestling after one of your coworkers just passed away? Because
I would have immediately. I know my thinking on that because I felt that immediately. I would have went and just said to the promoter, "I think we need to stop the show right now, as it's the right thing to do. It's a sensitive, that to me sort of conjured up the idea that money was more important, that the profits stood above the well-being of that individual. And I think that was a mistake. So if I was on that card at that time, I would have said, I don't think we should carry on. And I don't know how anybody could have followed that match and not had in their mind that that was the wrong thing to do. But again, that was just my personal opinion. There might be other people that feel that the card should have continued, but I just think morally it was the wrong thing to do.
How was your experience working with Bobby Heenan in WCW as an announcer? Because, of course, he's one of the all-time greats in the business.
Yeah, he was, he's a terrific guy. He was as funny in the dressing room, or he and I had a chance to chat on several occasions. And he was a witty, he had great one-liners. He was very quick-minded. Yeah, I enjoyed the guy. I was deeply saddened when I heard that he had passed, and I wish I had because of I live so far away, living in Canada. I would like to have spent more time with him. There are several guys who stand out in the business, I should say, that there were some great guys in the business that were a lot of fun to be around. And you mentioned Owen, he was one of them for sure, and Bobby Heenan was another. And there were a lot of great guys. If there was one piece of the business that the public may not have been aware of, but I think it's the same in the music industry or in the film industry, is that there's animosities, there's jealousies quite often. I saw that periodically. I think sometimes the jealousy was if someone was working on top and they felt like that they weren't suited to be there or whatever, it was a heel didn't like a heel, or a baby face was jealous of a baby face. There was always, that was a bit of an issue also. There wasn't as much camaraderie as people might think. We traveled a lot together on long trips and that. And, there were certain guys you gravitated to and you got along great with, and they were great in the ring and great outside, but not everybody clicked. And I think that's probably the general thing in the world we live in. We're not gonna be loved and liked by everybody, but I've learned that I avoid the negative and try to hang out with people who are positive. And I've been very lucky to know a lot of very positive, successful people.
There's a fan on here that would like to know, what is the craziest fan interaction you had in your career?
The craziest fan interaction. My goodness. I can't say enough about the fans, to be honest with you. I can't say craziest, but I will say supportive. I think, and I've said this before publicly, that our business goes nowhere without the fans. There's no higher adrenaline when you can leave the dress room and walk into an arena and there's 10,000 people there cheering and yelling and screaming and asking for your autograph. I mean, I've often related to the fact that you walked into an arena and the place was near empty and there's 10 people there. Are you going to feel the same excitement, the same adrenaline? Of course you're not. So the fans, I mean, really, I can't say enough about the fans, to be honest with you. I think I'd once mentioned there were three elements to the success of the show for me. Was obviously the media telling our stories, which is so important, like your show as an example. I mean, the world gets to know us and they stay in touch with us and they remember us because of what the media does for us. And then number two, working with other wrestlers who are probably a lot tougher than I ever was or would be, and they allowed me to win and work my way up the ladder of success. I mean, I'm always grateful for that. And, number three, promoters giving us an opportunity. But maybe the biggest piece was the fan support. We do shows in 30 below zero in arenas, and I'd get to them sometimes and think, my God, why would anybody want to come? And these people would come from miles and miles away and buy the tickets and fill the arenas and support us. So craziest fans I can't think of, but I can certainly say gratitude to the fans. They gave us our careers. Without you or without the fans, there would have been no career. So I am extremely grateful for their support.
I think the last match you had was at Stu Hart's 50th anniversary show at the Corral.
Yeah,
About 4,700 fans in attendance. What
right.
made you get back in the ring for that event? Because I know the last interview you did with me, you said you finished on a WWE show with Hulk Hogan,
Right.
a packed Saddle Dome, and you were kind of content at that point. Was it just out of respect to Stu, or was it something else?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm glad you brought that point up because I tend to forget that. I always consider my career ending in 1985. I was 40 at the time, and that was the big Saddle Dome show with probably 22,000 people there with Hulk Hogan, the whole works. I thought it was a great time to finish and move into a new career. But then 10 years later, uh, Stu Hart's birthday, the 80th, they'd asked me if I would be a part of the show in the Corral. And like you say, there were over 4,000 people there. And I said, absolutely, any role I could play to pay tribute to him because I was always grateful to him. Without him, I would have had no career. So this was a great opportunity to express gratitude. So a lot of the biggest names in the WWE showed up for that. And I said, I'd do a match, but I said it'll have to be fairly short. And I trained for about 3 months. I remember I lived on a golf course and I was running around the golf course every day for about 5-6 kilometers, trying to get myself back into some sort of shape. But I went out. It was more of a tribute to Stu. It certainly wasn't any idea about resurrecting my career in the business. I'd always had personally, and without any names mentioning, I always felt some guys stay too long in the business. Their skills deteriorate. They physically don't look as good as they used to. And I think sometimes, in the world of all sports or entertainment, sometimes people stay too long. They should retire earlier. So trust me when I tell you, when I was in 1995, I was 50. I did the very best I could to do the best match I could, but it was short. It was like 7-8 minutes long. And it was more there as a tribute to Stu. And it was a very highlighted evening. I must admit, it was a lot of fun to see him enjoy his 80th birthday. And I always had great feelings, fond feelings for him and appreciative of what he did for me. So it was the very least I could do for him.
I've heard they're tearing down the Corral right now.
Right.
Are they also tearing down the pavilion, or are they going to keep the pavilion around?
No, actually, they tore down the Corral. If I'm not mistaken, I believe it's gone. The pavilion, I believe, was renovated, and I think it's still effective for whatever they use it for. I'm not sure. I haven't been down there in a few years. COVID has really kept us in the last year. We're pretty housebound here. But yes, the Corral was a great place. Actually, one of the biggest cards we ever did there, I did it with Archie Goldie. And we sold that place right out. It was an angle that we had shot over 4 weeks, and I remember that as a highlight, really, in Calgary. As one of apparently we turned away over 4,000 people, couldn't get tickets. They wanted to come in, so that was really a special place. It was a great building to hold matches in. It had the acoustics. It had everything that was perfect, lighting. It was a great building. It's certainly going to be missed from a wrestling point of view.
Mantis would like to know if you have any stories about Tokyo Joe, who for a long time was in Calgary training New Japan wrestlers, but he also was a wrestler prior to his accident where he lost his leg.
Yeah, I never worked with him, and I really didn't get to know him personally, but I am aware of the fact I believe they were going to Lethbridge one night on a trip or something, and he was struck by a car when he was outside the vehicle. They pulled over for some reason, and then he lost his leg, but I really didn't get to know him well. He and Mr. Hito, he was another fellow who did a lot of training and that with guys, but I worked with Hito in the ring a couple times, good worker, but Tokyo Joe, I really can't comment much on him other than he was around, but we didn't get to know each other well.
A few fans on here have been wondering if you knew J.R. Foley well.
Oh, yes, very well. Yeah, J.R. Foley, what a character he was. Like, really, he brought as much value to the show as Ed Whalen did. He was a character, if you will, I remember he had his army. He was sort of the general of his army, and I once infiltrated it, and I was a villain for a while. I said I was going to join his army, and we had a lot of fun. I gave him some ideas about his army, and it was actually my idea to join his army and infiltrate it and pretend that I was going to be a bad guy. And then I double crossed him in a couple of weeks. And of course, that set the stage for matches with Mukka Singh and all the other guys that he had in his army. But he was really a real character. If you got to know him personally, he was just as funny as hell and a very likable guy. Yes.
Did you ever wrestle on Emile Dupree's territory on the East Coast where a lot of the Stampede wrestlers would go during the summer months?
No, I never did. I worked with a lot of guys who came out of there because they came to Calgary, obviously. Great guys, Leo Burke and a few of the other guys, really terrific fellas. Another great guy, very likable, personable guy, Leo Burke. I hope he's doing well. I'd heard that things had not gone too well for him in retirement, but I hope he's doing okay. So, yeah, there were a lot of the guys came out from back east and worked in Stampede Wrestling, and they were all nice guys. I never met one of the Eastern guys that wasn't a nice guy.
Actually, I talked to Ross Hart last week, and he told me Leo is not doing that well these days, unfortunately.
Oh, is it a health issue? Do you know?
I think something to do with dementia, I believe.
Oh, yeah, I'm, that's one of the saddest things. I mean, getting old is a privilege. Okay. There's a lot of people who are gone who would just love to have said, I'd like to live longer. But one of the downside is that we lose so many of our friends and associates. And the older I got now, I hear more and more stories. And unfortunately, a lot of them are not the great stories you want to hear, and I'm sorry to hear that about Leo. Nice guy. And Ross Hart, incidentally, is probably one of the most astute guys you will ever talk to regarding Stampede Wrestling or the wrestlers. He had a photographic memory, and boy, he, a real ambassador, I must say, for the business. He always spoke well of everyone. He always very informative, and his attention to detail I was quite marveled by it. He'd remind me of matches that I had forgot. So I'm happy to hear that Ross is well. I haven't spoken to him in a while, but I hope he's doing well. I believe he's a school teacher, or he's probably moving towards retirement soon, but he was always a great asset to the business and represented the family very well.
Yes, he actually watched your first interview that you did with me, and he told me that he liked it. He also mentioned to me when I spoke with him last on camera that towards the late 80s, when Dynamite Kid was around, there was quite a few backstage fights in Stampede Wrestling. Did you see that as much in the 70s, or was it more calm back there in those days?
It really depended on the individual, I think. I never saw a lot of it. There was a jealousy for sure. I saw it quite often. You'd hear guys bad mouthing other guys, and you could pretty well associate it to jealousy. The violence, I didn't hear a lot about. There were, I think I mentioned in your last show, there were several guys that were kind of bullies because they were very skilled as amateur wrestlers or maybe even street fighters, that some of them have a chip on their shoulder. So there was the odd guy, like I mentioned Billy Robinson as an example. But I never really saw any situations. I'd heard of some fights that occurred, but I was never present during them. But I think there was some animosities that sometimes led to guys that were fighting. And why it started or how it started, I'm not too sure. But as I say, I was very aware of some of the jealousies for sure in the business, and that could have led to fights. Absolutely.
Careless Whisper wants to know if you ever had any interactions with Steve DeSalvo / Steve Strong.
Yeah, I do remember him. He was at Stampede Wrestling. He was a massive guy, great big guy. I don't remember him as a great worker, but that was early on in his career, so he might have become a better worker later on. But he was kind of like superstar Billy Graham, a big, impressive, massive, great, good-looking guy, and he had sort of that Samson look. He had the long hair and all that, and I kind of thought he might go on to, become a superstar. I wasn't sure, but I lost track of him after a while and never heard of him again. But he was a very likable guy, very personable in the dressing room. I didn't get to know him outside the business well, but very impressive looking guy. Whereas I think Billy Graham, who I've spoke of before, went on to become a real superstar in the business, obviously. And I've heard recently that he's been going through a bit of a tough time with diabetes and had some operations. So if he's watching the show, I certainly hope that he's doing better and things will work out well for him.
Yes, I believe he lost part of his toe recently, which is sad to hear.
Right.
Sunview is wondering if you have any memories of Wayne Bridges from England or Mighty Joe Quinn.
Gosh, Wayne Bridges. We first started in Vancouver together. He traveled with me. What a nice guy. What a class act. I believe he passed away, if I'm not mistaken, in the last year or two. He had a bar in England. I lost track with him, but what a real gentleman in and out of the ring. Very fit. One of the real nice English guys. I had the privilege of working with a lot of the English guys. Les Thornton is an example. Great guy. Very personable, very fit. Just a lot of fun to be around. Wayne Bridges was another one like that. Jeff Ports was another one like that. Great guys. English boys really brought a skill to catch as catch can wrestling, to Stampede wrestling that was unique. They brought moves and they were very physically minded guys. They were just really a great addition to the show when Stu started bringing them in. But Wayne Bridges, I can't say enough about. He just was a terrific fella, and we spent a lot of time in Vancouver together. He traveled with me, and hours and hours of great conversation. Terrific guy. I hope I just was sad to hear that he passed on.
How was the Vancouver territory compared to the Calgary territory?
Oh gosh, night and day difference. Total different. Audience was even different. The trips were definitely different. I liked traveling in Vancouver. The trips were very easy. We go over to Vancouver Island, or we go down to the Chilliwack or surrounding. The trips were never that long. Alberta's trips were the longest anywhere. The other place that I did some long trips was when I was in Louisiana. We did Arkansas, Mississippi. Those were very long trips. California's trips were not overly long, but they were fun because it was great driving around California. But BC, the trips were great. And once in a while, we go to Prince George or something, they'd fly us in. So it was great. And the matches were different. The fans were different. It was a different sophistication to the fans out there. Alberta fans are spirited. I always really enjoyed working in Alberta. Just something about the fans. Not that I didn't like Vancouver or out on the coast. I loved it. Matter of fact, the environment was a lot more gentler. We didn't have 30 below out there and 2 feet of snow to travel through. It was always easier to travel. But it was a different culture. I found as I traveled throughout different territories that sometimes you would find it was a little different culture no matter where you went. So you had to adapt, a little bit of a chameleon. The subjects in your interview sometimes were different, and your whole persona sometimes were different,
And last question I'll ask you for today is if you have any tips on being a heel. I know you were mostly a baby face, but obviously you have a great mind for the wrestling business.
Well, the only thing I will tell you, I hated being a heel. I hated it. Only because of several things I recognized immediately when they made me a heel in Los Angeles. Was one, I didn't think I was big enough, 6 feet, 220. Most of the heels were much bigger. The psychology of a heel was different. I don't think I had the look of a heel. I was so used to working as a baby face that I knew the psychology is, it was so simple, the psychology of a baby face, but the psychology of a heel was complete reversed. And so I never liked it much. I just, I never liked being a heel. And also, you know what, getting drinks thrown on you and people threatening you, and I'm walking through the crowd thinking, if you only knew, I don't even like being a bad guy, but it elevated my position dramatically. I mean, I had the belt down there. I worked with some of the biggest names in the business, Bruno Sammartino, the Tolases, the list goes on and on. I went to Japan because of being a heel. So I'm grateful I had the opportunity, but it was a one-time only trip for me. The one piece that I had someone recently ask me in an interview, what advice would you give to a young upcoming wrestler? And, I think about that. I think that it's important that you follow your dream, pursue what it is you want. I had that opportunity and I was appreciative that I had it. Someone afforded me that chance. But be prepared to recognize that if it doesn't go well for you, start thinking about your exit, about what else in life it is you can do to pursue another opportunity. Because I think a lot of wrestlers don't really think about life after wrestling. They're not prepared for it. That transition is important. You have to reinvent yourself. So some of the strong tools in moving forward is networking, being associated with successful people, hang out with people in business, find out about what your skills are, and be prepared to pursue wrestling. Give it all you got. But eventually, if it's not going anywhere for you, don't be afraid to exit it and move forward with your life, because sometimes as one door opens, a bigger door ahead of you opens and life can get better. So I look at my experience and say that I'm grateful I had a wrestling career, but I'm also really, really grateful that I was able to find a career after wrestling that afforded me the ability to become somewhat successful. And the other piece of advice is don't neglect the most important thing in life. And I think that's relationships, is that your family, and I've made mistakes and I'm sorry for them. And I will, I wear them forever. But I think it's critical that you consider your family and the people who are important to you is a high part of priorities in your life.
Well, that's great advice for wrestlers out there. I hope that they're listening and paying attention to that. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us again, and I'm really glad you survived that horrific jail situation where you were held hostage. That is just an amazing story that someone could make a movie out of for sure. But thank you very much, and I'll let you close this off however you want.
I just appreciate being on your show. And again, I'd like to highlight one point, is that you folks in the media, whether it's by video, by writing, by film, whatever it is you do, photography, you preserve our careers. You're a part of our legacy. And I say without you, the world would forget about us pretty quick. So here I am at 75 years old, and I'm on a program which I'm addressing questions and talking to fans and talking to you. I appreciate that. So thank you for what you do.
Thank you for watching the Hannibal TV. Please like this video if you enjoyed it.